Good. I propose that we get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this 7th edition of the OECD Champion Mayors Inequality Matters series webinar, which today will be focusing on what has become a hot potato for many governments across the world, housing in cities, and in particular in the COVID-19 era. My name is Aziza Akmouche. I'm heading at the OECD, the division that deals with cities, urban policies, and sustainable development within the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities, headed by Lamia Kamal-Shawi, who will provide some opening remarks in a minute. And I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's webinar. I'd like to share a few housekeeping points before we get started. The first one, for your background, we are recording the webinar today, and the recording will be made available on the Champion Mayors webpage in a few days. So this is for everybody's background. We're not operating under Chatham House. This will be made public to a wider audience than the 100 plus participants who are registered and connected today. You can definitely use the chat function to contact our support team if you have any technical difficulty, and we invite you throughout the webinar to submit any question you may have for any of the prestigious speakers you will be hearing from via the Q&A function, so that we can have an idea of the pipeline of questions. Some of them will be answered directly via the Q&A by our panelists, and others will require live interventions, which we will schedule in between the interventions. Also wanted to let you know that for this hour and a half, we'll be using a number of interactive tools to engage all of you throughout the discussion, and invite you all to share any findings, interesting messages you see out of the webinar on social media. Our handle is at OECD_local with the hashtag Champion Mayors. We're going to explore today the very important topic of housing in cities, and we have for that a very distinguished set of panelists that I'm delighted to introduce very briefly now, and I'll do so when they take the floor. We're delighted to have with us Mayor Michael Hancock from Denver. Thank you very much, Mayor, for being with us. You're part of our Champion Mayors Coalition, and we look forward to hearing from you. We also have with us Michaela Kauer, head of the Brussels Liaison Office in the city of Vienna. Welcome, Michaela. We're delighted to count with the participation of Daniela Grabmulerova, who's the Deputy Minister for Regional Development in the Czech Republic, and also Sjoerdje van Heerden, Scientific Officer within the Joint Research Center. We really look forward to hearing from all of you in a few minutes. And meanwhile, let me invite our director, Lamia Kamal-Shawi, to take the floor for some introductory remarks. You all know Lamia, probably in the audience. She's the mastermind and the founder of this Champion Mayors initiative, and oversees OECD's work in this field as a general. Lamia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Aziza. Is the sound okay?
Crystal clear.
Great. Thank you so much, Aziza, Sena, Sujin. Thank you, Deputy Minister, dear Mayor Hancock, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this webinar on housing in cities in the COVID-19 era. As Aziza just mentioned, this is part of the OECD Champion Mayors Inequality Matters series. And it's especially appropriate that we're here today on Human Rights Day, since access to housing is one of the most basic rights, we have to recall it. Providing access to affordable and adequate housing remains one of our more pressing challenges, with far-reaching social and economic consequences. And many cities are at the center of the storm, particularly large cities. They struggle first and foremost with housing affordability, because housing demand outpaces supply in most cities around the world now, leading to rising house and rental prices. Currently, 1 in 3 low-income private renters in OECD countries spend more than 40% of their disposable income on rental cost alone. This is really huge and not sustainable. So building inclusive housing market has really been a cornerstone of the Champion Mayors initiative. Members have been actively addressing issues of affordability, such as the mayor of Reykjavik in Iceland, who has engaged work with non-profit developers to ensure affordable housing is available throughout his city, especially in areas of high opportunity. But then we have also cities such as Bologna, Leeds, Lisbon, but also Denver. And here we have to praise the action of the mayor. These cities have developed a wide range of tools to advance inclusive growth, including through housing cooperatives, but also as part of more housing comprehensive plans. So these days, it's very hard to talk about anything without, of course, mentioning COVID. And in the case of housing, challenges have been with us for a while. But actually, the pandemic has made what used to be widely accepted now socially unacceptable, because the housing crisis has revealed the bad things. It has left vulnerable groups exposed to rampant spread of the virus, and when half of the world's population were told to stay home, it became clear that those who don't have a home or live in overcrowded housing were less able to comply with physical distancing and were more exposed to the virus. And because the pandemic may be exacerbating the housing crisis over the medium term by making more people unemployed and homeless, we have seen many national and local authorities taking emergency actions since the outset of COVID to protect their most vulnerable citizens. And for instance, I'm thinking at cities like Lisbon, Milan, Bogota, and Montreal. Well, actually, the homeless have been sheltered. There are also many cities where rents for social housing have been suspended. And even national government, actually, they have been very active. In several countries, they have been taking very specific action and solution, for instance, through financial support to low-income families to avoid their eviction from their house. But clearly, temporary action is not enough. Meeting the housing challenge will, of course, require bold long-term changes. It's not a new issue. It's something that has just been exacerbated by COVID. So it requires a lot of changes. Changes to regulations, of course, special planning and related regulations are undoubtedly important to achieve desirable and more sustainable urban forms. However, again, it's important to carefully design the regulatory regime, and the wrong type of regulation actually can strongly reduce housing supply and thereby exacerbate pressure on the already high housing prices. Changes to tax policies to incentivize development and more efficient land use. Changes to our urban spaces by reconsidering how we use the immediate urban spaces around us, something actually COVID has forced us to do, whether this be via the rapid take-up of teleworking, redesigning commercial space for housing, why not, or bringing brownfield land back into use, and of course changes to support available to support available funding to the poor through well-targeted affordable housing programs and assistance for the homeless. The center that I'm leading with colleagues, works to support cities and countries, not just cities, but we're working with national, local, regional governments at all levels. We are supporting governments to deliver on their efforts in these areas. And because national governments, they also have a key role to play. This is a matter that is not just for local governments to address. National governments should be involved. They have a key role to play in shaping housing market. Um, So therefore, we are also looking at the impact of national urban policy instruments on urban form and housing affordability, as well as a mechanism of coordination, which are essential, coordination across levels of governments, of course, which are essential to achieve the results. So Sujin Kim, who leads this work on housing in cities, she's going to tell you more about our activities in this area right after me. So I'm going to stop here, and I would like, of course, to thank our great panelists today for sharing their time with us. I look very much forward to hearing their experiences, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you will enjoy the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lamia, and warm welcome to the additional participants that have joined us now. We have over 100 stakeholders, including several mayors, from the city of Victoria. Online, for example, welcome Mayor helps with us, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. Let me now turn to Sujin, as Lamia said, to set the scene and share with you some of the messages that have come out of the work we've been doing on housing in cities for almost a decade now, and how some of these have been rejuvenated in light of COVID-19. After Sujin, we'll have a poll to warm us up, and then we'll get into the panel with the distinguished panelists. Sujin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Azizi, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So over the past 20 years, during which we worked with dozens of cities and urban ministries, we have actually never met a mayor or a minister who told us we are doing great on housing. At the OECD, cities and countries, of course, generally come to us when they have a policy issue they would like us to help solve. And housing is often very high on their list of problems. If we can go to the next slide. Of course, it's almost a given that housing tends to be more expensive in cities than elsewhere. But in many cases, house prices in cities also tend to increase even faster than the national averages, as you can see on this first graph. In the countries where we have internationally comparable data with, of course, a handful of exceptions in cities. Then more people also live in overcrowded units in cities than in smaller towns or rural areas, as you can see in the second graph. And if we go to the next slide, the problem in cities is more than a simple issue of building fast enough to meet the growing population needs. It's really about getting the right kind of housing in the right place in cities. And if we take two examples of countries that we have reviewed over the past 5 years. So for example, Mexico had launched a program of mass production of housing, but primarily where land was cheap and therefore not necessarily connecting this new housing to jobs and other opportunities by adequate transport infrastructure, which means that many of those new houses ended up remaining vacant in many metropolitan areas. In Korea, the second example, the stock of what they call substandard housing nationwide has decreased steadily over 10 years, but the share of this substandard housing located in cities such as Seoul and other big cities remained pretty stable, which means that the problem of housing quality also remained very much an urban problem. And this matters tremendously. If we can go to the next slide, it really matters, especially from an inequality point of view, as per the objective of today's meeting in the OECD Champion Mayors for Inclusive Growth initiative, because where you can afford to live within a city actually determines your life chances over your life cycle. So it determines, for example, your chances to access jobs. Our study called Divided Cities showed, for example, that when a neighborhood has 1%, just 1% more white residents, each resident in this neighborhood can access 18 more jobs within a 30-minute commute on public transit than a resident of a more diverse neighborhood. And where you can afford to live also determines your future earnings. In the examples of the Netherlands, which is a relatively egalitarian country by all standards, we saw that children who grew up in the poorest neighborhoods ended up as an adult earning 5 to 6% less than those children who had grown up in the richest neighborhoods. So this is not just a matter of finding, a place to stay, a house for everyone. It's really about shaping the economic and social health of our urban communities and the chances of our future generations. Next slide, please. Such challenges, of course, are not new, but among the many harsh realities that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated in cities, housing challenges are really among the most striking. So I don't know what your house looked like during the first lockdown this spring, but it turns out that our housing conditions were pretty unequal, and this became really clear during the pandemic. So some people were holed up in cramped apartments like these ones, trying to juggle, remote working, childcare, other tasks, while other richer households could lounge in bigger places and could enjoy terraces or even better gardens for the luckiest of them. And while most of us have shifted to remote working overnight, it's also because most of us are living in cities where more jobs can actually be teleworked. Generally in cities, it's between 40 and 50% of all jobs that can be worked remotely, compared to only 20 to 30% in rural areas. And if the trend to remote working, the trend of remote working is to stay with us, it might translate into some higher demand for housing, particularly in smaller towns. And some observers out there are already talking about the revenge of mid-sized cities over big cities. We'll have to see about that, how permanent this is also. But this is something to keep in mind in terms of housing markets in different types and different sizes of cities. Next slide, please. The good news is that COVID-19 has not just aggravated housing problems, it also pushed some housing solutions forward, since most cities and countries, of course, took emergency measures to keep people at home. And the momentum that came from these short-term support schemes has also allowed for more medium-term actions on the housing front that are actually transforming the whole urban development model, and not just the housing sector per se. So for example, measures to, freeze or cancel rents, shelter the homeless, build more social housing are contributing to a more inclusive recovery in cities. And measures to improve energy efficiency or enlarge the size of balconies, sidewalks, are helping make streets more breathable in our cities and driving this greener urban recovery. Cities are also leveraging digital technologies such as building information modeling techniques or robotics in the construction sector, which can help reduce construction time and accelerate housing supply. And you will find many more concrete examples from more than 100 cities in our note on cities' policy responses to the pandemic here. But in the long term, and we can go to the next slide, please, cities can't do it alone. They actually have very limited resources to supply more housing directly. Already, municipal governments across OECD countries only account for 13% of total public revenues. 13%. And when you look at how they spend these revenues, you see that only a small share can go to housing and community amenities in general. That's the small dark blue bars you see on this graph. After cities have covered, responsibilities such as social protection and general public services and education, healthcare, etc. Housing is also a perfect example of how misalignment across national, regional, local policies related to housing, or between housing and other policy sectors such as transport or climate, this misalignment can generate contradictory incentives, so that even well-intentioned policy instruments ranging from property tax, inclusionary zoning, rent control, all these well-intentioned policy instruments can still have side effects on the shape of cities, for example, by encouraging urban sprawl, by increasing emissions, facilitating, spatial segregation, etc. And you can read more about this in our latest paper, where we actually mapped the effects of different policy instruments in a sort of traffic light system way. And you will see more examples there. So we really look forward to hearing how our panelists are navigating this complicated landscape and are working on making housing more inclusive from a city's point of view, from a national government's point of view, and also from the European Commission's point of view. Also, and I'm coming to the end of my presentation here, also please do tell us how your city is doing on the housing front. And if you're interested also in joining our urban housing community and receiving more specific policy support and policy guidance from the OECD, please do reach out. I'll stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sujin. Very enlightening, and I think many of the issues you've spotted related to urban planning, mobility, environmental externalities, policy coherence, but also the fiscal capacity will probably be echoed by the underground testimonies that we will shortly hear from the four distinguished panelists. Before this, I would like to invite all the participants to participate in this little poll that we are proposing on Mentimeter. You have three ways of doing so. You can either, if you have a smartphone, just scan the flash code that you see there, and that will take you directly through the question, or you can go to the chat where we have put basically the link to the poll and the password that you would need, or you can go directly to menti.com, type it yourself, and enter the code. And here is the question that we are asking you, and everybody again is invited to participate. What are the keywords that come to your mind when you think about housing in cities in the COVID-19 context? You can type up to 3 words or short sentences, a combination of 2 or 3 words. I think that now probably most of you have accessed, yes, the survey. So I suggest that we start sharing the screen where we can see the results of the voting that is happening live. So again, the question, keywords, whatever comes to your mind when you're thinking about housing these days of COVID-19. And we see indeed a very strong focus on inequality, overcrowding, health, teleworking, and many of the opportunities that arise from this digital era. Things related to the outside space. We'll take maybe an extra 10-15 seconds to give everybody a chance until I see numbers stabilize a bit, and maybe we'll close the poll. And maybe on top of the questions, I'll be asking the 4 panelists if there's anything you would like to share that you find surprising or not so surprising in the keywords that you see coming up with the word cloud. Big focus on inequality, as we can see through different words. Affordability issues also come regularly back, issues related to housing supply and living conditions. Some items related to energy efficiency, indeed, gaining a lot of traction in the recovery packages these days to build back better. and many other options that I'm sure will be enlightening. We'll make sure we share those results with all the participants. Thank you so much for participating. Maybe we'll stop sharing the screen, but we'll let an extra 5-10 seconds for those that didn't have a chance to input. And it's now my pleasure to turn to our first guest today. Mayor Michael Hancock from Denver. Thank you so much for being with us. We've been remarkably impressed by the equity-focused approach that you had in prioritizing investment in cities, children and youth, and starting also record investment in affordable housing and tripling basically funding for services for those experiencing homelessness and many other initiatives that provided a very strong rationale for you to join the OECD Champion Mayors Initiative. Thank you very much, Mayor, for being with us. I have two questions for you, which I understand you'll be addressing with a few sets of slides. The first one is that we know Denver has experienced quite steady population growth that has led to significant housing pressure. And we also know that over the past 9 years of your mandate, you've really made it a priority to address this housing affordability issue. If you can tell us a bit more about what COVID-19 has changed in the nature and level and type of commitment and measures that you're taking today compared to the long track record of looking already at this issue for the past decade, and what you see coming as more opportunities or more challenges. That's the first part of the response. And the second part is more, if you can give us some hints, very concrete examples of measures that you have taken and implemented during the pandemic, and how you think these can be mainstreamed over the long run in the strategy that you have for housing and urban well-being in your city. Thank you very much, Mayor. You have the floor.
Thank you, Aziza. Thank you so very much. And to Lamia and the OECD organization, thank you so much for having me, for the invitation to join you this morning for this, I think, a very critical conversation. I am proud to represent a city that is a member and has been a member since 2016 of this organization. And I think the topics that you're covering are critically important. And to your first, at least one of your questions, and we hope to answer both of your questions in short order, Aziza. Unbeknownst to us, our efforts to address critical shortage of housing starting back in 2012 really prepared us for COVID. And obviously we didn't know then what was going on, but our goal was to create a more level playing field and greater accessibility to affordable housing for our residents. So let's just jump into this for just a moment. You know, we are a city that has seen a growing economy, a growing population, and a housing not growing at the same rate. And I think Lamia laid that out so appropriately well. Our demand was far outstripping the supply in Denver. People forget that the United States had emerged from a pretty amazing economic recession in 2010, 2011, which, you know, saw a lot of people displaced from their permanent housing, the homes that they were paying for buying. And many of those folks had moved into rental apartments. And when the economy began to pick up, more people were moving into our city, and they were younger. Many of them were not employed, but they were looking for apartments. And so that created this tremendous pressure for rental, while many of the folks who typically are owning homes were in those apartments. And there was not a lot of building that had taken place during the Great Recession. So we started seeing this in 2011, 2012, and we initiated an effort called a 3x5 challenge. And this was really, I think, what Lamia pointed out, or the mayor of Reykjavik started, which is, by the way, a great city, was to kind of ignite the awareness within the marketplace that we are in a critical place and we have a critical shortage of housing. And the 3x5 challenge meant we wanted to build 3,000 new affordable housing units in 5 years. And fortunately for us, the market responded. It responded phenomenally well. And we were able to meet that target goal within 4 years, as opposed to the 5 that we had started. But it continued to grow our awareness, and we created some other innovative programs, such as our TRUA program, which is TRUA, which is an acronym for Temporary Rental Utility Assistance. The goal was to provide temporary assistance to those who may be housed, but for whatever reason ran into a minor economic challenge Maybe it's an illness that came on them and they just couldn't work, and they needed help with their utilities or their rental assistance. And we provided initially $1 million. I can tell you that within a matter of less than 2 months, that $1 million was gone. Maybe less than 3 months, it was gone, which kind of further underscored to us the real need in the marketplace. But we doubled down and continued our efforts to fund. But I'm grateful that TRUA was in place when COVID struck. It was 3 years old at the time. We funded it out of our general fund. And let me say this, in the United States, housing is typically a federal and state program, not at the local level where mayors like myself sit. But I was the first mayor in Denver's history to actually allocate general fund money to provide affordable housing. And that was because of the critical need and the fact that our federal government simply was not able to move fast enough to help us. So we've been able to grow the program using federal, this is our TRUA program, using our federal coronavirus relief funds that the federal government passed down to us during this critical time. During coronavirus, during this pandemic, TRUA has helped 1,900 households stay in place with their utilities, but also with their rental assistance. And we even helped some people with their mortgage payments because they lost their jobs. By comparison, last year, before the pandemic started, we helped just under 1,000 people, 996. So 1,900 this year during the pandemic, less than 1,000 last year in 2019. The average assistance is about $1,100 per household in the city of Denver. So the program is primarily serving those who are low income, they're wage earners, they're earning less than what we consider 30% of our area median income, but it has made a huge difference. And so we have buffered it using our federal CARES dollars, but their general fund money also has added to our ability to assist. So that also, COVID has also heightened our focus and awareness of those who are unsheltered in our cities, are homeless. And so on March 12th, when I, as mayor of the city, had to issue a state of emergency and order folks to stay home, we saw an elevated awareness of the folks who are unsheltered in our community and the need for us to respond immediately. As others disappeared from our streets, homeless are certainly much more evident to all of us. And so there were some opportunities within this pandemic that we wanted to leverage, and we did. So there was a rapid transition of sheltering system of our 24-hour, 24/7 model. This was extremely important. If we can go to the next slide, we began to move toward less than an emergency shelter to more of a 24/7 model. We laid the groundwork for moving our sheltering system from an overnight emergency to around the clock sheltering. And we created a 3-year shelter strategy. We were able to advance this strategy in just a number of weeks, which is just absolutely phenomenal. And I got to tell you, our private sector moved in to help us as well. They were partners in helping us to do this. Instead of just having folks show up at night, we were able to keep them there during the day and connect them to critical services, which were extremely important. We were able to integrate healthcare services there. We were able to test people for COVID. We were able to think about how we might be able to, help them get access to other critical services and partners while they were with us. And this was important. So instead of walking the streets during the day, they were able to stay in place and to get those critical services. There were a couple of benefits that we noticed from our 24/7 shelter. One, we lowered the anxiety of our neighbors who were unsheltered. With assigned beds, they could rely on each night. That was their bed, their space. We improved their sleep and their ability to engage with case management. We earned their trust and they were able to work with a case manager. We improved relationships between leading to rehousing platform. We were able to rehouse a lot of the folks, some in transitional, some permanently, and that was a critical step for us. We were able to encourage people to come inside, that it was safe and that it was clean and that they would be okay in this space. And many took our offer. We also had, again, effective primary and behavioral health services and care for those who were in need. This integration of healthcare within our shelter system was very, very important. So we had strong partnerships with a lot of external organizations. They advised on how to run shelters during the pandemic and making it healthy. Of course, it was important to make sure we spaced the beds that people were in. sanitized the locations, the restrooms. We had showers come in, as you can see in one of the pictures there, how the beds were spaced, but also the contact with medical professionals. And so this was important. The testing strategy, I got to tell you, has been amazing. And we can tell you, pleasantly surprised and thankfully, that our testing rates within our positivity rates within our homeless community, quite frankly, has been relatively low. And that has made a huge difference. And I think that says something about the program, the services, but also for the people, our neighbors who are unsheltered. We had a lot of referrals come through there. But I want to share with you, we also had some innovative financial programs that we've been doing in the city of Denver, and these are important. One is called the Social Impact Bond. All over the world, municipalities might issue bonds to build roads, buildings, to I don't know, affect some major capital improvement in the area. But we undertook a unique prospect about 6-7 years ago, where we issued what we call social impact bonds in the city of Denver. And we went to investors who wanted to do some philanthropic effort, but they can do it with regards to their investment. And so we raised money in the bond market and used those dollars to build transitional housing with wraparound services for members of our community who were homeless. And it has been today a phenomenal success. I can tell you in that transitional housing, in excess of 80% of those individuals after 3-4 years remained in place in that transitional services and connected to critical transitional housing and connected to critical services. The other one was just this past November, Aziza, I'm proud to tell you that we passed what we call 2B, but the people of Denver made an investment to dedicate part of their sales taxes to homeless services in the city of Denver. And so now we are able to raise anywhere from $35 to $40 million a year to support members of our community who are unsheltered and connect them to critical services. So it's not just shelter, it's also all the other critical services that are necessary to move them to a more stable lifestyle. Let me finish with this. We have, my administration has put a strong priority on equity. And I know that inequality was one of the key words that kept popping up in the word cloud there. And I got to tell you that there are racial disparities, even in those who are experiencing homelessness and person with the least resources during this emergency. I was struck by Sue Jin's presentation because she is so on target. And not only do we see disparities in neighborhoods in terms of access to jobs and to services where you have majority white people live and are less number of people of color, but in communities of color, we also have a word in the United States that we use in terms of amplifying the inequities that occur. When you have these type of housing pressures in a city, you have involuntary displacement, or better known as gentrification, occur in neighborhoods. More financially able individuals look to housing, they look for good affordable housing, and they tend to move in neighborhoods where that has been perennially underserved and also perennially under-resourced, and economic wage earners are relatively low. We have, as a city, moved in with the value of equity guiding us in our housing. We got to protect people in their neighborhoods. We got to help people stay in their homes, and that's where TRUA came from. We have spent $50 million of our $95 million of emergency spend during COVID to help members of our who are unsheltered in our community with sheltering and connectivity to services. We've opened up new shelters during COVID. We've worked with hotels, and we have leased rooms during COVID for those who are who may be at risk, those who are actually positive, and those who need to get out of congregate care for their own health and safety. And so that has made a world of difference. We've deployed a testing strategy for low income, but also for our most vulnerable and our own shelter. And we are opening up, this week we opened up our first ever safe outdoor space, where we allow for managed encampments for members of our community who are unsheltered, and connect them with services. All the critical services are there outdoors, and organizations in the community are hosting them with tents and with connectivity to services. And so again, I'm proud to be here. There's been a lot of work done, not only during COVID, but starting back in 2012, when I first became mayor, to begin to close the gap in our city with regards to those who need afford access to affordable housing to bring down the number of folks who are overburdened with rents and mortgages in the city of Denver. And OECD, you are covering a critical issue. And let me just say this, which is also important, and this goes to Sujin's presentation. There is no greater indicator where poverty exists, where people are housing stressed, where they might be overburdened with rents and mortgages, than the lack of mobility. And so if we don't include transportation, infrastructure, and mobility into this conversation, then we miss the mark. We've got to make sure that people who are struggling, also, we understand they can't be overburdened with their mobility options as well. If they're stuck and they don't have mobility options available to them, then they don't have access to good jobs, healthcare, schools, and what have you. Or they may be paying way too much in terms of car insurance, gasoline, to be able to access jobs, schooling, medical care, and further exacerbating their condition. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Mayor Hancock from Denver. I think it's been not only very concrete, but also very inspiring. And what we can see from your storyline is that probably the foundations that you set back in 2012 have been instrumental, not only in terms of the hard, but also the soft infrastructure to contain some of the effects of the pandemic and to protect the vulnerable groups during the crisis, but will probably also be very relevant to deploy the vaccine going forward. And I think there were a lot of the examples you provided in terms of sheltering that I'm sure will provide good food for thought, combined with what you were mentioning in terms of innovative financing and how you've been working hand in hand with the state and federal levels, this multi-level governance being really at the core of getting the housing crisis fixed. Thank you so much, Mayor. There may be several questions, and I see some of them already in the Q&A, so I can only invite the 100+ participants to submit their questions via the Q&A, and we'll have, if we're on track and everybody sticks to the time, a good 20 minutes for Q&A after the different panelists have intervened. So please continue to submit via the Q&A questions you may have for the mayor and forthcoming speakers. And it's now my pleasure to turn to our second guest and invite Michaela Kauer, who's now the EU liaison officer for the Office of Vienna in Brussels for the last decade. But Michaela held very important positions in the past related to housing. She's been coordinating the EU partnership on affordable housing, which ran between 2015 and 2018. I think this is when we had the first iterations with Michaela, but also she served as the spokesperson of the Vienna City Council for Housing and Urban Renewal, as the head of the City Council for Health and Social Affairs. And Michaela, here is my question to you. I think there's not a single benchmark ranking, comparative analysis among different cities that we've come across for the past 5 years where Vienna is not globally renowned for its commitment to providing affordable housing, also for its smart city strategies, I have to say, which maybe can be combined, and in particular for its housing, social housing model. And I'd like to ask you, what you think have been the most effective policy instruments that Vienna has been using to provide affordable housing for all, and most importantly, if you think those instruments and those policies have passed the COVID-19 reality check, and if they still hold relevant in the pandemic and post-pandemic context. Michaela, thank you very much for being with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Aziza. And I must say, I'm very, very delighted to be here today on behalf of the mayor of Vienna. I have to bring you his warm greetings, but he cannot join us today because he has just, it's the budget week in Vienna. So they are sitting in the city council and deciding on a, I don't know, post-corona budget at the moment. So that's all he's taken by his duties. I'm sorry that he cannot be there, but I will do my best to represent him and my city. And first of all, I would like to congratulate OECD to organize this, not only in general, but especially today, as this is Human Rights Day. And I think that this is worth a little bit of thought and reflection when we're talking about housing, we tend to also now discuss also it from an angle of a rights-based approach very often. And the new urban agenda and the sustainable development goals, they show us the way forward. And I think what we can share from Vienna is also something like a little bit the practice of taking a human rights approach in housing. I think that when it comes to the Corona crisis in general, Vienna had the chance, and I'm quite sure that this is also known here in the audience, to be able to rely on a very stable and crisis-proof system. Because I'm not sure if everybody knows it, but we have a very big share of people living in social, public, cooperative housing in Vienna. We have about 500,000 people who are living in municipal housing. So that's already a big share of the population. That's a quarter of the population. We have another 400,000 people living in cooperative housing. So in total, we can say that nearly 60% of the Viennese population do live already in a very protected sector of housing. And that makes a big difference, I would say, with regard to resilience in crisis times. We've seen that already when it came to the global financial crisis, and we do see it now when it comes to the health crisis we are all faced with, confronted with. So I think what we did, and I really like the little graph of Sunjin in the beginning. What did we do of all of these measures that were observed? Of course we did the freezing of the rents, but we also added to that an eviction stop in municipal and cooperative housing, because this is where the city of Vienna, also as a province with legal power, could impose it without asking any other layer of government. With regard to the private rental sector, we had to wait for the national government, in fact, to put a ban on evictions, and that took them a little bit longer. So we do see that aspect of governance and who is interfering and how do you have to arrange yourself in, especially in times of crisis. This is interesting. We obviously also had to help homeless people. Now in Vienna, as everybody knows, we have a very good situation with regard to housing, but still, obviously, we have people who are homeless. But when we say homeless, it's people who know we take care of them. It's very impressive what Mayor Hancock explained from Denver. And we do the same, and we try to really secure that homeless people who normally would only go to places where they sleep, they could also stay there during daytime. They had access to medical care. Everything was done to help them. So still there is an issue, obviously, but we did our best to try. But what we also did, and I think this is something that many cities have been doing, we also took care of the people and the most vulnerable people who stayed at home and became even more vulnerable. And that was, for instance, women who became victims of male domestic violence. So we continued. We are very, very proud to have a very stable and strong network to help women who are victims of violence. But we put a special attention on it, a special focus on it. And we really made sure that those women could get help very fast, that they could go to the women's shelter homes, that they would get assistance and everything that's needed. Also, what they would get in normal times, they should also get in crisis times. Because obviously, Corona did something also with regard to violence at home. And what we also did, and it was interesting to see that in Sunji's slides, building more social housing. At the moment, we are building around 14,000 units in the city of Vienna because we are a fast-growing city. We will attain the 2 million inhabitants in a few years. So that's really putting a lot of pressure on our whole infrastructure. We need more schools. We need more, technical infrastructure below and above ground. We need to do all of these things. We need obviously more housing. But we also, in the midst of the crisis, our mayor declared that he's going to add on top of it another 1,000 units of municipal housings. So I'm quite sure that not a lot of cities could do that, but we could build also on a very stable financial basis. We did our best to build resources in the past, but obviously we are also very, very concerned about what's going to happen with the recession that is coming up now everywhere. Also in Vienna, we will lose tax-based income from the national tax revenues, and we are not sure where this is going to end up. So budget-wise, at the moment, we are safe, but still, I think that this is a concern of not only many Austrian cities, but also of many European and in general cities around the globe. One aspect that was also mentioned by Sunji was the aspect of green space and accessible green space. And here again, we had a little a strange experience, I must say, with the layers of government. Because in Vienna, you would typically have a lot of parks that are owned and administered by the city. They were all open. But we also have a few big parks owned by the national government. One is well known to everybody. I think it's the Schönbrunn Park. So the one around the Imperial Castle in Vienna, the yellow building. And that's closed. That was closed, amongst others. So there was a big fight and a big discussion in Vienna to open also those parks because they were close to densely populated neighborhoods. So I think you can see these layers of government, sometimes it's very difficult to find a good solution fast, especially in times of crisis. So that was one of the examples. What we also did, and I think when it comes to housing, I mean, we can build on a very, very stable and crisis-proof system. And I must say that it's composed of basically a few elements. We have a strong element of state intervention and public intervention in the housing sector since many, many years. And I mean, everybody knows it, since about more than 100 years we do that. We have capped rents, we have rent controls, we have also unlimited rental contracts as the default option, always. We are not talking about limited contracts, rental contracts as the normal case. This is not what we feel in Vienna. We do a lot of investment in housing every year. About half a billion of euros is going to the housing sector every year. We maintain social mix. That's also super important to us. And we have a strong element of tenants protection. So we even have very low threshold dispute settlements where, I mean, tenants normally, they don't have access to, very expensive lawyers, and it's a high burden. It's really not easy to go to court. So what we do is we offer off the city dispute settlement procedures where we really try to mostly moderate a conflict, and mostly we also find solutions. So there's a high level of control, and there's a high share of publicly owned or publicly funded housing in the city. And I think this makes a big difference. And another element I would like to mention, because this I think also makes a difference, is in Vienna, nobody is ashamed to live in social housing, as in many other cities I've been seeing and discussing. Often social housing is something like, I would say it's a stigma. Yeah, people don't like to do it, and very often also in reality it becomes an element of discrimination. The address will not open you the door to a good job, the wrong address. But in Vienna, people are proud to live in municipal housing. Yeah, we had the municipal housing is something which is part of our urban culture, I would say. It has, it's beautiful buildings done by the best architects when we started all of this 100 years ago. It's excellent buildings when you look at them now, when we look at things like energy efficiency, also usability, connectedness to green spaces. So we really did our job on that. And people are proud to live there. So there is even chorus singing. We had a chorus singing in Corona times of the municipal housing tenants. So that was great to see that people were also helping each other and sticking together and living solidarity at its best.
Thank
but I
you.
think
very much. I will invite you to conclude, Michaela, please, so we have enough time for other
No
responses.
problem.
If you wish
Yeah.
to add a few seconds, and then we
Yes.
move to the next
No,
speaker.
I could talk for hours about that, obviously. I'm sorry.
And it's hard because there's so much passion and so much relevance in what you're saying. It's hard for me to cut you off, but
No.
anything you would
I
like to add to
completely
wrap up?
understand. Yeah. No, but what I think now that's necessary is when we want to discuss how to upscale maybe things like we did in Vienna, we have to look at a whole set of measures, and it will be very difficult in times of recession to try to implement those when we have very ambitious plans on the table from the European Commission. Renovation wave, climate targets, social pillar, all of these, but there we will really need to be to have the funds targeted to city, the money earmarked for housing. These kind of things are now where we wait for the European Union also to deliver directly to cities. And just the last word, because I was so impressed by Joe Biden, the president-elect, that one of the first things he did was to invite mayors and to discuss with mayors. And we're still waiting on European level for an invitation of Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, to talk to the European mayors, because they really know what people need on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michaela. No doubt that the next steps regarding the Green Deal, because a lot of this is related to energy efficiency in building and housing affordability, somehow will definitely put on the spotlight this shared responsibility across levels of government. I think a lot of what you said in terms of your experience dealing vertically with the state and federal levels is something we've observed in many countries where this pandemic was probably a magnifying glass on what is working well or less well in terms of this multi-level governance. Thank you for those insights, and please let me reiterate that if participants have questions that are targeted to Michaela or echoing some of the messages that she conveyed, you are invited to submit them via the Q&A, and we'll make sure after the next two speakers we devote at least 15 minutes to responding to the questions. So I'll invite the next two to be concise to the extent possible. Let me now turn to Daniela Grabmulerova. Daniela, you're the Deputy Minister of Regional Development of the Czech Republic. We're doing these days together a full-fledged review of housing in Czech cities that is very enlightening. You've held also past positions as chair and vice chair of the Bureau of the Committee on Housing and Land Management in the UN Economic Commission of Europe, and also as member of the Bureau of the PrEP Committee of the Global UN Conference on Housing and Urban Development. So you have also this combination of very local, national, and global perspectives. This is the question I'd like to ask you, Daniela, and if you can respond in a good 5 minutes. What are the measures that you have adopted in the Czech Republic to support people in need, including this law that is prohibiting landlords from serving notice on tenants who are in financial distress due to COVID-19, which we found quite exemplary? And based on your experience and your global knowledge of what other countries and cities have been doing, is there anything that you think has been framed or shaped as being temporary to handle the pandemic, but that would deserve to be more lasting and mainstreamed in housing strategies and policies over the long run? Daniela, you have the floor.
Thank you, Aziza, for the floor. And I'm not successful with the starting my video. Thanks for the first slide. Next, please, slide. The situation in the Czech Republic, definitely this year is extraordinary one. And as regards the Czech Republic, unlike offices and jobs, the housing market continues to grow in this year in the Czech Republic, attracting both families and big investors. And high demand is enormous due to the uncertain microeconomic situation and extremely low interest rates in the Czech Republic, banks' interest rates. The demand for residential real properties is growing, and also as alternative investment for big investors. Housing construction. Czech construction sector has been facing enormous shortage of workers and craftsmen, partly because of the lowest unemployment rate in Europe and partly due to the closed borders for qualified workers, for example, from Ukraine. And second reason, Czech Republic has very complicated, administratively demanding and lengthy process of issuing of building permits. Mortgages, of course, record volume of mortgages is a logic consequence of high demand. Record demand of recreational real properties, maybe you know that like in France, every third Czech family owns a recreational real property, and quite often these holiday buildings are fully equipped, habitable all year round, so it's a real alternative for housing. Because of pandemic situation and home office opportunities, demands for these houses has grown significantly, and prices too, of course. Short-term rentals, it's the global situation, the influx of tourists has practically stopped this year. Before the COVID year, as I can say, in Prague city center, capital Prague city center, every fourth apartment had been offered through online platforms for short-term staying of tourists. And therefore, laisties, because of the global situation, the so-called tourist apartments have newly appeared in the long-term rental market. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see some temporary measures reflecting the COVID situation. Very important one is a social measure. Persons and families in financial troubles because of the pandemic situation can apply for one-time emergency social benefit. And rent moratorium and all others. All in all these emergency measures have been used rather exceptionally. In fact, it's good news for us, for ministries and politicians. The vast majority of landlords and tenants can agree on some special regime voluntarily. However, these measures are important as emergency assistance and background. And what was very important, that some inspiring, some hotels in Prague and some other cities not used for tourist accommodation, offer their rooms as temporary accommodation for people in quarantine, homeless persons, and people with a mild course of COVID disease. I really appreciated that Mayor Michael Hancock from Denver and also Michaela Kaur from Vienna mentioned the homelessness issue as a very important one, also for the big cities in the Czech Republic, etc. Next slide, please. What have we learned from all this? Definitely, the Czech Republic needs a new legal framework for investments. The current complicated process of building permits is a real barrier. And the proposal of a new building act is now in second reading in the parliament, and it's supposed to be adopted in the first half of the next year, hopefully. And the main goal of the new building act is simplification, acceleration of a building process. And of course, all processes will be digitized. Brownfields, my colleagues from Denver, from Vienna, have mentioned this issue. It is very important. Efficient use of brownfields in large cities is very important also for the Czech Republic. In Czech cities, there are many brownfields which could be potentially used for new housing construction, either by private developers or by public or non-profit developers. Rental housing, big issue for the Czech Republic. A more available and affordable rental housing would help to improve the overall situation of urban population. And at the same time, it's clear that short-term rentals in cities should be regulated somehow. And there are many inspiring examples all over the Europe, and not only all over the Europe, but maybe nobody knows it would be needed if tourists stay at home also in following Greece. Hopefully not. Non-profit cooperative housing where members of the housing cooperative are at the same time tenants is a long-term known and favorable to some time non-profit housing in the Czech Republic. And I appreciated the example of Vienna. It's an extremely interesting and inspiring example also for the Czech Republic. And seniors resulting from demographic changes, like in other countries, of course, in the Czech Republic, the proportion of older people is growing. And therefore, it is necessary to reflect the situation and to prepare some effective tools for this kind of population. Thanks for the floor.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And some of the points you conveyed actually trigger a few questions. I'll keep them for the Q&A on notably the new national housing concept that you're developing these days in the Czech Republic. I'd be interested to learn how some of these lessons basically feature in this new concept, and what are the one or two paradigm shifts that you're taking away. If you can start thinking about that, and I'll get back to you after our last speaker. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Churchi van Heerden. Churchi, you're working at the European Commission's Joint Research Center. You're performing a lot of research and analysis on different territorial and urban issues, in particular those related to housing in the European cities, whether it's investment, construction, or tourism. And I know you've recently released a report, quite provocative one, on who owns the city, and where you're emphasizing that the financialization is one of the drivers of increasing housing prices in European cities. And if you can share with us some of the evidence that you've observed, and whether any city has actually managed to address this increasing financialization of the housing market. I think this would be very enlightening. Also linking back to some of the statements made earlier around social bonds and other innovative financing mechanism. Churchi, if you can try to stick to the 5-6 minutes, that way we can take a few questions and answers. And let me invite again the participants to submit questions you may have via the Q&A function meanwhile. Churchi, you have the floor.
Yes, okay, well, thank you very much. Of course, I'm delighted to be part of this webinar series, and also to share with you some of the findings of our recently published report, Who Owns the City? An exploratory research activity on the financialization of housing in EU cities. This study was done before COVID-19, but nonetheless, we believe that knowing the situation in cities beforehand also helps to better understand how COVID might impact them later. Next slide, please. So first of all, just very quick, a survey conducted by the European Commission in 2015 shows that a large majority of respondents that live in EU capital cities do not feel they can find affordable housing. Of course, highlighting the fact that house prices are a serious issue of concern. At the same time, we also saw signs that investors are increasingly active on urban housing markets, buying up residential properties, using housing as a vehicle vehicle for wealth and investment rather than a social good. So these observations has led us to conduct our report, where we look at the financialization of housing in some EU cities, as well as the affordability of housing in these cities. Now, housing financialization is not a uniquely defined concept, but in general terms, it refers to an increasing dominance of financial actors, financial measures, financial practices in the housing market. So one thing we did was to look at institutional investment by national stock listed companies in multifamily property units in Amsterdam, Barcelona, Berlin, Madrid, and Stockholm. And as you can see in the graph, the data show an upward trend between 2013 and 2019, indicating that a growing share of available multifamily property on the market is bought by institutional investors. Now, these findings also relate to what we saw at city level. For instance, in Berlin, the two biggest private property owners, Deutsche Wohnen and Vonovia, they belong to the 30 biggest and most valuable companies of the Germany's main stock market index. Interestingly enough, also our analysis showed that private individuals systematically pay more per square meter in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, it shows per square meter than investors. So this fuels the assumption that professional buyers have better deals or better access to capital or better access to construction work, or also because of the ability to buy in bulk. Next slide, please. Now, one other form of housing financialization that we observed in all cities under analysis is smaller private investor activity, which is largely concerned with short-term tourist accommodation. For example, the external attractiveness of Portugal changed the residential markets of Lisbon and Porto in significant ways. Airbnb entered the Portuguese market relatively late, but expanded massively from 2015 onwards. So the figure on the left shows the location and the number of Airbnbs in Porto. First, now it's quite red, but first it started as a little bit of the measles. So as you can see on the graph on the right, the expansion of Airbnb actually strongly correlates with the house price level in the city. So in this respect, some neighborhoods, and in particular those with the most are the most attractive to tourists, saw housing prices increase in such a way that they are unaffordable now for local residents that still have salaries that are compatible or consistent with the national averages. A second more general observation is related to the Golden Visa program, which is mostly applied in southern EU countries. And this is a program whereby non-EU member state nationals can obtain a residency permit for the Schengen area in return for real estate investment. So for instance, we see that in Athens, investment packages exist where you buy Golden Visa property, but combined directly with the management of the property as a tourist rental. So in the past 5 years, this program yielded for Greece about 1 billion euros, which corresponds to about 40% of the net foreign capital inflow for Greece for that same period. Okay, so clearly, whereas some groups profit from the high prices and the high returns on tourist accommodation, affordability issues are increasingly seen for all cities, and especially among renters, younger generations, and the lower and middle classes. And many cities struggle with improving this situation. Next slide, please. So policymakers across the EU are faced with the challenge of keeping their city affordable and accessible. So in this respect, multiple policies are implemented or being planned. And regarding investors, one category of measures concerned land use instruments, whereby the city, whenever it owns the land, can condition its use, or at least its future use, for investors. But Berlin, for instance, altogether halted the selling of its land to others and converting everything to leasehold constructions. Another category concerns fiscal measures. So for obviously like subsidies for the youth or for lower and middle classes, or tax breaks or benefits for those who rent out affordable housing, but targeted more at investors. For instance, in Amsterdam from next year onwards, they are starting with higher transfer taxes for investors, like 4 times as high as for those individuals who are entering the market as private individuals or newcomers. And also some cities proposed or are implementing the zoning of tourist rental accommodation, restricting it in certain areas or districts. And also in general, we observed a stronger reinforcement of the regulation that was already in place. Maybe quickly to mention is also that Berlin recently bought back some of the property they had actually sold to investors some years ago. Of course, they had to pay a much higher price for it now, but it also allowed them to gain back a bit of control over the property. Now, regarding the EU level, it's good to point out that the European Commission, there's no official mandate on housing. However, of course, indirectly, EU policies do affect the housing markets. Now, for instance, if we look ahead, the European Green Deal is a large action plan to make the EU's economy sustainable, and the new European Bauhaus will act as a driving force, bringing this Green Deal closer to the citizens. And the renovation wave of both public and private buildings has been singled out as a key initiative in this respect. So the Commission will help national, regional, and local authorities to use all available financial resources, including grants and subsidies, to focus investments on the most vulnerable. Being as in the Joint Research Center, so the in-house scientific knowledge service of the European Commission, we are of course looking now into how we can best support future developments in housing by providing more and better empirical evidence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Churchi. This was extremely enlightening. And if you can put on the chat the link to the report, I'm sure this will be very useful reading for our audience today. Let us now move to responding or trying to respond to some of the questions that were asked. And we've had a very dynamic crew, over 100 stakeholders online. That's a lot of questions. I'm not going to embrace all of them, but I would like to direct 3 of them to you, Mayor, if you agree, and invite you. That's a difficult exercise to stick to 2 minutes in responding to them. There's a first question on whether you have some experimentation or demonstration of social bonds. You were the one making reference to that, and if you see potential there for replicability elsewhere. There's a very simple question on whether Denver has a resilience strategy, or if you're in the process of developing one that goes way beyond housing. But I think these days of Build Back Better, it may be inspiring to others. And then there's a very specific question on whether you are worried that you may face more pressure on your services after the lifting out of the eviction moratorium at the end of the year. And I think that goes back to this, how the temporary becomes lasting, or what can be the collateral effects of the end of such measures. Mayor, 2 minutes. I count on you to help me help everybody finish on time, and then I'll have specific questions for the other 3 panelists.
So first question, yes, we believe that the SIB, or the Social Impact Bond Program, is replicable and can be scaled up. Those of us who participate, or most municipalities and states participate in the bond market and believe it can be done. There are a lot of investors who are looking for a cause, a philanthropic cause to invest in, and this is one way to do it, as well as receive a return. I need more information on the resiliency strategy to understand what the questioner is getting at when he talks about resiliency. But obviously our focus on trying to respond to the most vulnerable in our community with regards to housing help prepare us for doubling down with regards to COVID. We had a lot of mechanisms in place that we could expand, grow, and to stress a little more to help us respond appropriately. But I'd love to know more if there's a possibility and we can respond at a later time. Yeah, we do expect pressure of services. There's also a pressure of being of focusing just on a city. As we emerge from this, we are a region, and if we're the only ones investing in services for on shelter or housing, then it really doesn't give us the scale and the value that we need. We need to be able to affect impact on a regional basis, and that's where I'm spending more of my time today, is talking to mayors and county commissioners and major neighboring cities to figure out how we can scale our efforts around, particularly around our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Michaela, let me now turn to you with a bit of a provocative question. We've heard a lot in your statement in terms of what maybe didn't work perfectly well across levels of government. And I think the examples you provided about the gardens was probably the most telling one. And we've faced something quite similar in Paris, I have to say. But would you have examples of what has worked well vertically in that multi-level governance during this pandemic containment, and for housing in particular? Is there anything that what has been experienced in Austria across levels of government that you think is a good takeaway?
I have to unmute myself. No, thanks for the question. I think that we have seen, in fact, in Austria that the whole management of the corona, I would say, crisis was highly politicized. So that's really something where we also have evidence. Recently, even there was a research by the London School of Economics, Urban Studies about that. So that there is a degree of politicization of the crisis management, and that was not an easy situation, I would say, in Austria. With regard to housing, I must say that it took the national government a bit of time, but in the end, they also put an eviction ban in the private rental sector. Although I do share all the fears that have been already formulated, what will happen after the immediate and acute health crisis, but when we are stepping into the recession and people will still have no income and will have the big fear to lose their homes. And it's not only about tenants, it's also about people who are not able to pay back their mortgages.
Crystal clear. Thank you very much. Let me now turn to you, Daniela. Going back to my earlier question, if you can elaborate a bit about this new concept for national housing that you're working on. And if you can also, maybe there are 2 or 3 questions related to the points you made regarding not-for-profit cooperative, the model that you have explained. If you can say a little more here again, 2 minutes for both items as teasers, and if there are any source or links that people can access to have more information about this, feel free to share on the chat. You're on mute, maybe, Daniela, if you can unmute yourself. Very
sorry.
good.
Sorry, now I'm on mute. Thanks for the question. Yes, absolutely agree. Rental housing is a partial and the youth potential for improvement of housing affordability and availability. And it's connected with flexible labor market flexibility. And I'm strongly convinced that sharing of international experience and exchange of knowledge, like through this event, is very important for formulation tailor-made and national strategies. As regard the Czech Republic, I see a lot of potentials, brownfields, use, private apartments, investors through the improvement of overall investment legal environment, and new housing strategy currently being formulated by this ministry. I am representing of the Ministry of Regional Development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and maybe Churchy, I will give you the most difficult one. I put you on the spot here. Not sure if your report is saying anything about the private rental market. There are a few questions around whether you think that we need rent stabilization mechanisms to protect the low and middle income households, rent caps, rent freezes. This exists in a number of countries already. You did mention Airbnb and the sharing economy, and we know many of the cities have actually taken provisions to cap the number of days and to make sure that some equity is maintained. Is there anything from your report on that private rental market that could be enlightening?
Yes, thank you for. Oh, sorry. Can you? Yes. First of all, thank you. Just note that my colleague Ricardo published the link to the report in the chat, so you can all find it there. And thank you for offering me the most difficult question. I appreciate it. Of course, in our report, we refer to Berlin, where we have the rent freeze, and the private rental market is hugely affected by the short-term tourist accommodation. So I advise you in that respect to see all the policies that that we name in the report, and these mechanisms are actually, I think, almost all of them are mentioned. What for me is actually the big question now is how will it play out with the COVID crisis? Because, for instance, in Amsterdam, although you have all these mechanisms in place, without these mechanisms, we do see now that because of a huge fall in demand for these tourist, short-term tourist rentals, there is a bigger supply for long-term private rentals, and actually prices in this respect are already falling. So for me, the question is not so much now about all these mechanisms, but how can we make sure that cities take this pause button, which the COVID-19 situation more or less provided, to see how tourism can be shaped and short-term rental can be shaped in a sustainable way in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being both concise and precise, but also highly enthusiastic and energetic in your responses. I'm sure this was extremely inspiring to the audience today. We have a good 4 minutes left. I would like to invite all the participants to take part in a last poll that will help us, and in particular, Sujin and her team, fine-tune a bit the next steps of the work on housing and cities that we are doing. So once again, we'll use Mentimeter. You have again 3 ways. Either you flash, you scan the code you see on the screen if you have a smartphone, or you go to menti.com and you enter the code. You have also on the chat, if you click on the chat, the direct link to menti.com. We'll leave this on the screen for 10 seconds. And meanwhile, I'll give you the question that you'll find there. In your view, what policy instruments are most effective to deal with housing challenges in the COVID-19 era? For each of the proposed instruments, you can rate from the least effective to the most effective. So you can do the grading yourself based on your perception. And you can do it for the use of fiscal tools, whether we're talking about taxes on vacant urban land, taxes on short-term rental properties, and so on the increase in public capital spending on social housing, on the upgrade for the existing housing stock, in terms of easing land use regulations, in terms of establishing clear tenant-landlord regulation and adequate tenant protection. So you can, for each of them, do your own gradient. And I think now everybody has accessed the poll. Actually, I'm doing it in parallel. So I'll invite maybe the team to start sharing the screen. If we can see real time, what are some of the preferences therein expressed? And I see numbers are still changing a bit. So increased public capital spending seems to come definitely first, followed by clear tenant landlord regulations and adequate tenure protection, followed by the different fiscal tools. Things are moving a bit, but more or less this is the ranking that I think is stabilizing, and easing land use regulations coming last, but being still a significant driver for housing prices. Some of the work we're currently doing at the OECD is precisely to correlate housing affordability with how restrictive land use regulations are, and I'm sure interesting findings will come out of that. Thank you very much. We can maybe let the poll go on for a few seconds for those that didn't have a chance. While I conclude this webinar, I would like first of all to thank all the speakers really for joining us and for your time and your passion and your wisdom. We were delighted to pick your brains today, and I'm sure this provided really valuable insights to many of our cities and stakeholders who are struggling with this challenge of housing in the COVID-19 era. We'll keep the conversation going. We have a lot of analytical work at the OECD ongoing in this field. If you are a city experiencing challenges or doing interesting things in terms of housing, please liaise with us. You have the emails of the team on the screen. We have in-depth dialogues with a number of countries, with a number of cities. We'd be delighted to provide targeted support and tailored analysis and data and guidance to your context based on good practices. As I said in the introduction, we recorded this webinar. It will be made available. You'll receive the link if you have registered to this session. And let me just give the final thanks to my team that has really worked day and night to prepare this session, both on substance and in terms of logistics. Thank you very much, Sujin, but also Sena, who's heading the Champion Mayors Initiative, and her colleagues, Juliette, but also Camille and Clara and Lucy and many others who are behind the screen and made this work excellently from a logistical and substantive point of view. So thank you very much. With this, I am closing this webinar. I am inviting the speakers to stay online, silent. You don't need to unmute yourself and switch your cameras off for a picture. We'll stop sharing the screen so we can have the gallery mode for our speakers, and we'll be sharing all this information. This is just to say bye to all the participants. Thank you very much. Stay tuned. Follow us on OECD_local #Champion Mayors. And let me invite the team, Sujin, Sena, Camille, Juliette, and all the others to switch your camera on, and we'll be taking a good picture in these digital days that make social interactions very difficult. At least we have this 5 seconds. So I'm taking mine, but maybe the team can do the same to make sure we have multiple versions if needed. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, Churchi. It was really a joy to spend this hour and a half with all of you, and I'm glad we made it on time. So thank you all. Have a good rest of the day, and we'll be in touch shortly. Bye-bye.